So I'd like to welcome you to our next webinar in our series of equine management strategies. This one will be dealing specifically with heat stress. This time of year, especially in the summers, we're starting to heat up a little bit, trying to manage that heat stress in your horses. We're very privileged today to have our guest speaker, Dr. Jenny Ivey. She's our UT Extension equine specialist. She joined the staff roughly 2 years ago. And so she's been a great asset and a real asset to the equine industry all across Tennessee. So it's our privilege to have her today. We hope to have her on multiple webinars as we go throughout the year. But at this time, I want to turn it over to Dr. Ivey and let her introduce herself and then begin our presentation. Dr. Ivey?
Thanks, Matt. So I'm glad to be here with you all today. I grew up in New Jersey, so don't hold that against me. I am from the north. But I did my undergrad at Rutgers, and being a student there really kind of got me interested in research. And so as I finished my bachelor's in animal science, I moved over to West Virginia University and completed my master's and my PhD there. And my focus at that time was very nutrition related and also exercise physiology. And so kind of blending those two things together, trying to figure out how we can better feed our horses and manage them from the nutrition side, and then also be able to impact their performance in a positive way. So that's my kind of general background in my area of expertise, but serving as the equine extension specialist here for UT, I'm kind of a jack of all trades. So I think over the next couple months as I visit with you all, we'll kind of go through some topics on fence management, some different nutrition planes, a little bit on facilities, and kind of walk through other questions that you may have just overall. So today specifically, we're going to talk about heat stress in horses. And I think this is a really good topic, especially for this time of year. I know we're starting to get into those months here in Tennessee where it just gets really hot and really humid, but everybody still wants to be able to be outside and work with their horses and their animals accordingly. And so being able to kind of identify those moments where your horse might be in some stress or ways that we can present it up front is really important. So I want to kind of start here, and I apologize, these pictures are blurry, but I couldn't get them to blow up any bigger when I took them from the NOAA website. But these two maps, one is today of the heat index across the country. And as you can see, you know, Tennessee sitting there, we're not too hot at the moment. Comparatively compared to what we have been, but the forecast actually across to next week on Independence Day, you can see that especially those states really right below us are starting to really heat up, and typically that's what we would see kind of across the board as we look through for the rest of the summer. And so thinking about what could cause heat stress and what this heat index means for your horses and your management is really important to consider, especially as you go through and maybe select times to ride or activities that you're going to compete in, and how you can help your horse and yourself too kind of manage these hotter temperatures. So the first thing to kind of think about, at least from my perspective, is why does your horse get hot? You know, we know that if they're just standing out in the field, you know, maybe they'll increase their body temperature, but there are some other things that happen that can actually impact how hot your horse gets throughout the day. And so it makes sense that we know that the working muscles produce heat. So as your horse is maybe going out and exercising or running around in the field or gets excited over seeing maybe a pasture mate or something like that, those working muscles are actually breaking down different metabolites within the body or different molecules that your horse uses for energy. And so what happens then is that as that breakdown occurs, heat is produced. So as those working muscles are releasing heat, we then are actually looking to see how much heat is being produced and how the horse handles that and dissipates it out of the body into the atmosphere. And so your horse, or you even, will lose heat in 3 different major ways. So the first is convection. So what that means is that the heat is produced within the muscle, and it actually gets transferred into the bloodstream. And then the blood, as it moves closer to the skin, will actually dissipate into the environment if the surrounding temperature is less than that of the horse's body. So say, for example, if your horse is working and maybe their temperature gets up to 102, but outside the ambient temperature maybe is only 90, there'll be a little bit of dissipation overall. From there, hang on, Karen, let's see if we can get you to be able to see the screen here. Is that any better? Matt, can you see my slides all right?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay. All right, so we've got convection, right? So the difference between the ambient temperature outside and how hot the horse is, that will allow that horse to be able to lose some of that heat to the atmosphere. The second and kind of the most obvious one is sweat. So heat is actually going to be transferred into the sweat, but also the sweat is going to kind of coat the horse's body and be able to take some of that heat away and evaporate it out into the atmosphere. And so one of the really unique things about the way horses exercise is that horses are one of the only mammals that actually have sweat glands all over their body just like people do. So they're able to truly sweat. They don't have to pant like dogs do, or they don't have to wallow like hogs or things like that. They actually do have a true sweating mechanism just like people. The last is respiration. So this is one that I know most horse owners, when we think about how your horse loses heat, don't think about respiration as being one of the primary means. But about 15% of that increased heat that the horse is producing will actually be lost through their respiration. So that's why even if your horse isn't working, but they get hot in the field for maybe a couple reasons that we'll talk about later, they will actually increase their respiration rate. And so we want to kind of keep that on the radar of things that you'll look for if you're suspecting heat stress or in your horses. And so the last piece here is warming up versus what we would consider overheating. So we know that as you maybe go out and ride your horses, that there is some value to truly warming up your horses or getting their body warm enough and their muscles working that we do see a rise in their body temperature. But what we want to make sure that we consider is that warming up is really different than what we consider true overheating. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. So when we think about overheating, this is going to be temperatures that are above what we would consider healthy or normal for that horse in whatever work it's completing. So when we consider what's normal, it's important for you to know what is normal for your horse, because each horse may vary ever so slightly day to day, and also may vary in between horse to horse. So knowing what your horse looks like on a regular basis pretty consistently is very important, not only for heat stress, but also in the event that your horse is having any other injuries, illnesses, colic, laminitis, all of those things. So on average, horses' water consumption can really vary. And this depends largely on body size, activity, workload. Are they breeding? Are they lactating? Kind of all of those things. But on average, your 1,000-pound horse at maintenance, the horse that's not working at all, typically will consume between 6 to 8 gallons per day. Now, this also will change depending on the ambient temperature, on the heat index, and a lot of other things as well. So it's important that that horse have access to water if possible. We usually recommend free choice access to water that's clean and fresh daily. But if you have the ability that you can only offer your horses water once or twice per day, conditioning them to that particular management style is important before expecting them to drink their water requirement in just 1 to 2 baths. On average, your horse will urinate between 1.5 to 8 liters per day. And typically the color of that urine should be straw yellow. And so sometimes it's hard to really kind of catch what color it is once it's hit the ground. So watch your horse's urine stream. And that straw yellow color should be pretty easy to discern. But the things that we're going to worry about later on are a little bit darker color or more red in color as well. The mature horse's temperature should range from 99.5 to 101.5. Their heart rate and pulse that you can either take in the jugular groove or down on the digital pulses is 32 to 48 beats per minute. If you have a stethoscope, you can also listen to it right behind the shoulder, or right behind the elbow, within the heart girth. Respiration rate for horses usually ranges between 12 to 24 breaths per minute. The caution here is to make sure that when you take your horse's respiration rate, that they're not panting or sniffing something, and that they're actually taking true breaths. And overall, your horse's attitude should be pretty alert. They should be interested, not lethargic, or not really and overly reactive. So again, know what's normal for your horse and check that pretty regularly. So when we consider kind of switching over into heat stress or horses that are more susceptible to having issues or intolerances to heat, we've got a few horses that we want to consider. So the one that's the most logical, I think, is the horse and work. So that horse that's trying to perform maybe in a high ambient temperature or at the peak of that temperature and humidity during the day, those are horses that we usually would consider more of a higher risk. The other is horses that are being transported overall. We know that trailers can get kind of hot, and just the overall stress of being trailered can cause changes in body temperature. But we also want to consider the horses that are moving to new climates. So if, say, for example, we're here in Tennessee, but maybe you're planning to take your horse to train in Florida for the rest of the summer. So even though we're hot and we're kind of considered in the Southeast, we typically don't touch a lot of the temperatures that we see in maybe the downtown parts of Florida. So keep that in mind if you're, either moving climates or coming down or have friends coming from north to south. Horses that are truly heavily muscled. So if we see the picture of that horse that looks really stocky and really muscly in the bottom, they actually can be at a higher risk of heat stress because of the amount of muscle they're holding and the amount of heat that those muscles can be generating. Unfit horses or overweight horses are also at a higher risk. And so this typically is because they may not have as an efficient sweating mechanism as that horse that's actively in work. And just like for people, those horses that are overweight sometimes may fatigue a little bit quicker or may actually need to cool their temperature or their overall body temperature down, and the amount of exercise that they're performing may look a little bit different and may be a little bit harder for that horse than the horse that's truly fit for that exercise. When we think of our geriatric horses, so it's kind of hard for us to pinpoint an exact age at which horses become geriatric, but we know from a physiology mechanism, around 20 years of age is typically where we start to see some changes within horses. So this isn't to say that every 20-year-old horse out there has to have special needs, but definitely something that we want to just keep an eye out for and make sure that they're handling the heat okay. If you have a horse that has a history of a heat-related illness or a disease that we'll talk about later that we know can compound how well they handle heat, definitely one to keep an eye on, okay? And also remember, if you're trying to breed your mare or you're looking for high milk production or things like that, heat stress can also negatively impact that reproductive performance or lactation of your animal. So why do we care about sweating and why do we care about this heat loss overall? So what we know is when horses sweat and when they sweat in high amounts, we worry about overall electrolyte loss. So one of the unique things about horses is that their sweat is actually hypertonic. And that's a fancy word for basically saying that when your horse sweats, it contains more electrolytes than the bloodstream and the rest of the horse's cells. And part of that is to be able to help that sweat be able to pull out and actually cause that horse to decrease its body temperature. But when we think about large quantities of sweat, so we're talking about multiple gallons of sweat being produced per day, we worry about dehydration and some electrolyte imbalances. And these imbalances come from a variety of things, but the main four that I have are put up on the screen. So we know that as horses sweat, some fluid is pulled from the bloodstream to actually make sweat. We also know that water reservoir within the gut, specifically in the cecum, is drawn upon to be able to produce these large quantities. We also know that fluid loss from between the spaces of the horse's cells is actually utilized, and then also from within the cells. So we know that these four things together, combined with the fact that horses' sweat is hypertonic, makes us want to think about how we can manage our horses better. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I want to kind of put this in your mind now that not every horse, so if you go outside in the field and see that your horse is sweating standing out there, it does not mean that he needs to have lots of electrolytes supplemented in the diet, okay? We're talking about the horses that are maybe in very heavy work or horses that might have, produce what you see this kind of lather type sweat during their working environment. So we're looking at our horses that are in heavy or very heavy work that are producing large amounts of sweat per day that we have to worry about electrolyte loss and supplementation. So when we think about what the stages of heat stress look like, we've got three different stages to evaluate. So the first stage actually begins with dehydration. And so this is one that you should be monitoring your horses for all the time. Dehydration can happen any time of the year or at any given moment. So it's important that you are checking your horses regularly to make sure that they're not dehydrated. So we have a few ways that you can do that. We can use what we call the skin pinch test, and that's what's shown in this upper left-hand picture. But you can actually go and pinch the skin either on the neck or right over the shoulder, and you should be able to pinch it and then drop the skin, and it should bounce right back. If it seems like that skin pinch or skin tent is kind of sticky and doesn't want to snap back right away, that could be a sign of dehydration. Another thing we can look at is something called the capillary refill test or capillary refill time. So if you pull your horse's lip up as shown in this bottom picture and press on the gums for a few seconds, as you release the pressure and move your thumb, the color within that area that you've pushed on should return within 1 to 2 seconds. If it takes longer than 2 seconds to return, it means that that horse is dehydrated. And so sometimes people will mistake this test for checking for anemia. And so if you see that your horse has a low capillary refill time or a slower capillary refill time, typically it means that they're dehydrated, not necessarily that they're anemic. Some other things that we can look for are elevated body temperature. So again, knowing what's normal for your horse will allow you to detect that. And same for an elevated respiration rate, like we mentioned before. Their behavior could be dull or depressed. So think about if you're dehydrated. You may have a headache, you may not feel like yourself, and that's usually what we'll see for horses as well. As we start to move through the stages of dehydration, you may notice that that straw yellow colored urine will actually change to be more dark in color. Or you may not see your horse urinate at all. So we want to make sure that that horse is urinating at the appropriate amount per day, and that we know that that horse is not having a low urine output. As we kind of transition out of stage 1 into stage 2, you may notice that your horse's heart rate will slow when we think about heart rate recovery time. And so what that means is that if you know what your horse's heart rate is regularly when they're at rest, and we measure it as that horse is working, we can determine how long it takes for that heart rate to go back to back to their resting rate, and that's called heart rate recovery. And so we know that dehydration will cause your horse to take longer to recover overall. So that's what we mean when we say a noticeably slower heart rate recovery time. So just a couple quick things to kind of help you think about sweat production, right? We know that racehorses are typically in heavy to very heavy work when we look at it from a nutrient requirement perspective. And so these horses that are truly racing in these higher environments, they can lose up to 2.5 gallons of sweat after just a 1-mile race. So that's a lot of sweat production. And again, this is where we would think about maybe adding in some electrolyte supplementation. And unfit horses can really lose even more sweat and electrolytes if they're working really hard. So stage 2, so we've kind of progressed past just general dehydration, and now we're looking at something called heat exhaustion or heat stress, okay? So we're starting to see the body temperature become very elevated, 104 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, remember that normal body temperature ranging from 99.5 to about 101.5, 100.5 in that mature horse. We know that in this point, we've already passed dehydration, so we'll see decreased sweat production and therefore a decreased ability for that horse to regulate its body temperature. You may actually see less sweating or a complete lack of sweating overall. And this is a really important thing to keep in mind, because a lot of people will say, oh, well, maybe my horse isn't that hot, they're not sweating, which actually could mean that the horse is in danger, but just has actually sweat out all of its water reservoir. So again, watch for that reduction or that cessation of perspiration. The skin pinch test, or that where you grab the skin on the neck or over the shoulder, will take greater than 6 seconds for that to come back to its normal state, okay? The mucous membranes may look very dark or very red in color, and that capillary refill time will be greater than 5 seconds. Again, the normal would be less than 2. If you check your horse's heart rate, it will typically be elevated if the horse is exhibiting signs of heat exhaustion or heat stress, but that elevated pulse may be very weak. So it may be kind of hard for you to find or hard for you to identify compared to what we would consider a very strong normal pulse overall. Your horse could seem depressed or lethargic, and something called inversion. So typically we'll see the heart rate be higher than the respiratory rate. But in inversion, it will actually swap. So their respiratory rate will be higher than their heart rate, and that's also something that's fairly dangerous. And horses may exhibit rapid or shallow breathing, or sometimes even gulping of air if they're exhibiting heat stress. So all of these, if you're suspecting that your horse may have any of these symptoms, call your veterinarian immediately, okay? We're gonna give you some tips as we move through of how to deal with them immediately, but your first line of thought should be to call your veterinarian and know that they're on the way and be able to have them give you advice. So the last stage is heat stroke. So this is kind of where we're really worried about the horse's ability overall to recover. So horses that are exhibiting heat stroke will actually stumble, they'll have difficulty moving. It may even look like they're disoriented, or they may look neurologic. They may exhibit some very irrational or erratic behavior. They can bite, they can kick out, they could rear up and roll over. Very strange behavior for horses, especially if you know this horse well. At this point, when we would see heat stroke, we're looking at damage to the heart, to the skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle, the kidneys, and the brain. So this typically is involved with body temperatures that are greater than 108 degrees. But even so, those temperatures that we mentioned in stage 2 are equally as concerning. And again, we want to prevent the horse from progressing to what we would call heat stroke. Most horses that are exhibiting heat stroke will collapse. There's not too much usually once they've kind of started stumbling and have that erratic behavior, they'll often fall and then typically are unable to get back up until they've recovered, if they have recovered from heat stroke. Okay, so now that we've talked about the different stages and you know what to look for, how do we treat this? Okay, or if you notice these signs after you've called your veterinarian, what can you do immediately to help your horse? So you should immediately stop working if you're working your horse and take your tack off. And we'll talk a little bit later, but if you have extra hands or someone to help you with this, someone can start cooling your horse while you're taking the tack off. So if we have to prioritize what to do first, removing the tack or starting to cool the body, cooling the body comes first. We also want to make sure that we are helping that horse to dissipate the heat. So we'll do that via cooling out, and we'll talk about some tips here in just a couple slides. We can offer water with electrolytes, but if you don't have any electrolytes present, just regular water is also acceptable. Get that horse out of direct sunlight, move them to shade, potentially if there's any breeze or a fan, that's also very helpful. So we're going to talk here about sponging or hosing your horse with cold water. And on the next few slides, we're going to talk about some myths and some recommendations that we have. But overall, evaporative cooling by hosing your horse out is very, very helpful in preventing heat stress and having dehydration progress through to heat stress and heat stroke. So we want to remove the water as you put it on your horse. So it doesn't mean that you have to constantly keep scraping your horse every few seconds. But you should be able to remove that heat, because if we think about it, the water will actually serve as an insulator. So we want to allow that water to absorb the heat out of the horse's body and then remove it off the horse's body to aid in cooling. We can add ice to the water. So this is something that has been kind of a myth overall that we'll talk about, I believe, on the next slide. And so the other important thing to note is that if your horse is in heat stress or heat stroke, or even sometimes severe dehydration, IV fluids might be necessary to bring that horse's blood volume and hydration level back up to where it should be. All right, so here's our recommendations and our myths. So in being in the horse industry for most of my life and also talking to a lot of owners, cooling with cold or ice water almost always brings up questions or comments or kind of, well, I heard this or I heard that. So I wanted to kind of address it here with you today. So the myth that I tend to hear most often is that cooling a horse with cold or ice water will cause that horse to colic or tie up. Okay, and that's not actually true. So for horses that are really hot, above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, that are cooled quickly, are less risk of heat stress and then progression to heat stroke. So if you take your horse's temperature or you suspect that your horse is suffering from heat stress or indicators of heat stress, definitely cool them down with cold or ice water. And if we think about why that's helpful, right, we talked about the fact earlier that horses' heat has the ability to dissipate through conduction. And so if we're able to cool the skin down to that ambient environment that that skin is in contact with, we not only can help to absorb some of the heat out of the horse's body, but allow it to dissipate through convection and through evaporation. Okay, so what's the recommendation here? Keep the horse moving. Okay, and this seems like kind of a strange thing to think about. If you're really hot, you probably don't want to move. Okay, but as that horse walks and moves, as that blood is circulating through their muscles, it's actually helping to pull heat out of the horse's body and that core temperature and bring it to the surface so you can remove it with that cool water. Okay, so keep the horse moving. Cool the horse with cold or ice water if it's available. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with water right out of the hose, or if you've got some buckets prepared, if you know horses are coming in from an endurance ride or from a hot day's work, put some buckets with ice. You can use sponges. We can pour them right over the horse's back. There's nothing wrong with that. But I will caution you, if you pour a bucket of cold water on the horse's back without any notice, they might jump a little bit. So just be aware of that. You can cool out with or without tack on. So again, if it's just you and you see that your horse is having some issues, your first thought might be to dump that bucket of water on their back and then take the tack off, and that's fine. Your first thought should be, how can I get water and start cooling this horse down as quickly as possible? With regard to scraping, like I mentioned before, so we typically recommend scraping your horse's water off as you're cooling every 20 to 30 seconds. So again, this is to allow the water that has absorbed any heat to be removed from the body and then be able to add new cool water to continue in that process, okay? And then overall, check the horse's rectal temperature. So we don't want to make that horse hyperthermic or hypothermic. And we only know how to do that by checking their internal temperature. So it's hard for me to say outwardly, yes, you've got your horse into a good, safe temperature zone unless I truly check your horse's temperature. So keep those thermometers close. You should have one in your first aid kit in your barn, within your trailer, and then also at ease of access if you're riding. So when can you stop cooling out? Okay, we can stop cooling out when the horse's rectal temperature at the high side reaches 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 102, to 100.4. So if we're in that range, we're okay to stop actively cooling with cold water, and we can let that horse recover. Okay. Another thing that you want to keep an eye on is their respiration rate is less than 30. So if that horse is still panting a lot, but you've got maybe their temperature down, give it a few more minutes and see if that respiration rate can't come below that 30 threshold. Some other do's and don'ts, okay? So don't put ice within the rectum. So this was something that a lot of trainers had done in years past, thinking that if we can put ice on the outside, well, wouldn't ice on the inside be helpful? And so this is not really a good thing for a number of reasons, but one of the major reasons is that if you have ice in the rectum, we can't take an accurate rectal temperature. So it may appear that the horse is much cooler because of the ice that's present there and not give us an accurate reflection. Okay, so no ice in the rectum. Do not hold bags of ice over the horse's body, either specifically over their head, between their hindquarters, on their neck, or underneath the tail. Okay, instead, take those bags and actually put them in the water, let that water cool, and then pour them over the horse if possible. And if you want to retain the ice, you can do that as well. Don't place wet towels on the horse. Okay, this goes back to the concept of why we need to scrape. Okay, so we want to scrape the water off the horse to prevent all the heat that's trapped in that water from being able to stay and keep the horse hot. So the same concept applies here. Those wet towels sitting on the horse's body will actually cause them to hold more heat in instead of letting it go. Okay, if you're an eventer or those in endurance or fox hunting, or those that use grease to help kind of let things slide off the horse's body, watch out for overuse of grease, especially in areas that we know are very easy to help horses thermoregulate. So usually we see grease on the legs. There's a lot of vasculature there that can actually help us decrease the horse's body temperature. But grease actually acts as an insulator, so it will hold body temperature in. So if there's a lot of grease on the horse you're trying to cool down, scraping some of that off will be very helpful. Like I mentioned before, don't let the horses stand for a long period of time. We want to keep them moving and keep that blood moving to bring out that core body temperature to the skin. And also don't restrict their water intake. So there's no problem with allowing horses to drink as much water as they would like if they're thirsty and hot. Again, this is kind of another myth that we had heard in the past, that if they drink a lot of water, they're going to colic. What I would say is maybe don't offer them buckets of ice cold water, but as much water as they'd like to drink, room temperature is great. Okay, so earlier in the presentation, we talked about some issues that may complicate heat stress, and we're just going to talk about 4 of them really quickly here. So the first is anhydrosis. We've mentioned that before, which is the decrease or inability for your horse to produce sweat. So there are some horses that are just naturally anhydritic. So they will not actually produce sweat at all. So if you know that you've got a horse like this standing in your barn, and you know it's going to be hot, it's probably going to be a fairly management intensive horse for you to try and keep that horse cool in these warmer months. What we can do for these horses is reduce their exercise overall, especially in the heat. Make sure that you're hosing them down with the methods that we've just talked about. And for the horses that we know are having this, what we'll see is typically a reduced exercise tolerance. So again, they're not able to dissipate heat, so they typically don't tolerate work as well. And their skin typically will feel dry and hot, almost like how you'd feel if you touched like maybe a dog that had been out in the sun for a long time. That would be how your horse's skin would feel. And horses that have anhydrosis may also pant in the stall. So again, that increased respiration to be able to try and dissipate heat. Watch for all of those signs. Anhydrosis can also be a side effect of dehydration, but again, you look for the same exact symptoms. There's also something in horses called synchronous diaphragmatic flutter, which is a fancy name, but really if we look at what the word says, makes sense, okay? So synchronous means that actually the flank of the horse will twitch with every heartbeat in synchrony. So every time your horse's heart will beat, the flank will actually start to pulse or twitch. And it has to do with the way the diaphragm is actually signaling electrical impulses. And so there's a complicated mechanism in there, but it boils down to some changes in acid base and electrolyte balance within the horse. And so we know that sweat causes horses to lose a lot of these electrolytes, and imbalances in that, severe imbalances, can result in thumps or synchronous diaphragmatic flutter. So it's something that if you see your horse's flank twitching or thumping, call your veterinarian, and they're probably going to recommend some sort of electrolyte supplement for that animal. Okay, what about exertional rhabdomyolysis or tying up syndrome? Okay, what we see for this particular issue is the horses may have muscle sweating or muscle cramping, excessive sweating, overall muscle stiffening or actually swelling in some cases, usually a reluctance to move the hindquarters specifically, and a very dark urine that's resulting from the damage to the muscle and the leaching out of what we call myoglobin that gives muscle its red color. There's different types of tying up that we could talk about, but this one in particular relating to heat stress is actually because of a change or an imbalance of calcium within the cell. And so again, we typically see this in horses that are suffering from heat stress for this particular type of tying up. The other one to consider in relationship is heat stress, in relationship to heat stress, is equine Cushing's disease. So we know that Cushing's disease causes horses to grow a very long curly hair coat that typically does not shed out as well. And so these two things combined, on top of the fact that here in the Southeast, we see our temperatures increase a lot sooner within the spring and summer than maybe some areas of the North, can be a problem for these horses. So watch out if you've got a Cushing's horse that still hasn't shed out. It may be a good time to clip those horses or really keep an eye on them and be able to help them overall with sweating and things like that and dissipating heat. The other thing that we want to watch out for Cushing's horses is that they may actually be sweating, not to the point that you'll see that wet hair coat on the outside, and that moisture can get trapped against the skin, and cause a variety of skin conditions, can actually cause that horse to trap heat and kind of be an issue overall, as opposed to helping when that horse is sweating. So keep an eye on your Cushing's horses overall. All right, so now that we've talked about what heat stress is, all the different stages, how we can manage it if your horse has it. Let's go back and talk about how we can prevent it overall. Okay, so allow your horse to have that clean water accessible all the time, unless we've, again, adapted them, and they should be able to drink their day's fill if needed. We also can look at dietary components. So we know that horses that are out grazing pasture actually will intake more water just because of how much water is contained in fresh pasture versus hay and concentrates. So keep that in mind. If your horse is grazing all day long, you may not see huge amounts of water being disappearing from their buckets. But as long as it's available to that horse, you can assume that they're drinking it all right. Fans and misting systems have been utilized pretty regularly throughout the horse industry. It's not to say that all horses have to have it or that they won't do well with it, but definitely can help, especially for those horses that may be in a barn or other areas that don't have great ventilation. If possible, utilize areas that have good shade. So even those horses that are standing over there kind of huddled together in the shade, if it's hot outside, that's a perfectly good and acceptable place for them to stand. And actually maybe even better than them standing inside of a building that may not have as much cross flow or good ventilation. Try avoiding working your horses during the hotter parts of the day. The morning is really great before the heat kicks in, and then also maybe at twilight or at dusk as well are good times to kind of help prevent heat stress overall. And again, like we talked about before, know what's normal for your horse. If you call and tell me that your horse's respiration rate is maybe within the normal parameter, I might think that that's okay. But if his respiration rate is always maybe around 12 breaths per minute, and now he's reaching 30 just kind of standing in the field, that might raise a couple flags. So check your horses regularly, keep them in the shade, provide good water, and hopefully we'll be good. Okay. Also pay attention to the heat index. So you can look at this on the NOAA website, or you can actually calculate it by yourself if you've got the equation and would like to do so. But temperature and relative humidity are pretty regularly accepted and easy to find overall. So you can use this chart at home if you've got it. But if the heat index overall is less than 90 degrees, your horse is probably okay. They'll be able to work normally and cool sufficiently as long as he's fit to do what you're asking of that animal. If we've got a heat index between 90 and 100, be cautious. Overheating is possible, especially with prolonged activity and exposure, and probably likely if we're really working horses pretty hard for a long period of time. Heat index of 101 to 129, the risk of heat stress is definitely high. So really try and avoid that cooler part or that hotter part of the day, ride during cooler times, take a break, and skip the high stress activities. And so you can check more. I'm sorry, I must have kind of accidentally deleted that hyperlink, but you can check more at uthorse.com or, like I said, your weather station to be able to figure out what the heat index is of the day. And so I also want to caution you, it's not to say that if you see a horse and rider working, in a higher heat index setting that's wrong or dangerous for that animal. Each horse may have a different ability or may be working at different times or different acclimations. So use good judgment for your horses, know what your horses are accustomed to, and try and avoid those really hot kind of extreme danger or danger settings if possible. So what about electrolyte supplementation? Okay, so I want to tell you to use caution here. So what we see within the diet, and typically on horses that are eating a good quality forage or good quality pasture, and then are actually consuming maybe a grain or a concentrate supplement overall, those horses are probably getting their minimum daily requirements and probably a good bit extra just from those dietary sources alone. So typically we don't see a huge need to supplement electrolytes on a daily basis, okay? But if you've got that horse in really high or heavy work that is sweating a lot, or maybe that horse that's really challenging itself to stay cool, and you see them really producing buckets and buckets of sweat per day, might be a good time to supplement electrolytes. So when you look for a good quality supplement, sodium and chloride should be the first ingredients. A lot of horse supplements on the market for electrolytes actually have sugar as the highest ingredient or the first ingredient on that list. That's not what you want to find. So again, sodium chloride or salt, NaCl, they should be the largest and most prominent ingredients within that supplement. Okay. It's also important to note that horses do not have the ability to self-regulate their electrolyte intake. So there's nothing special about the horse that allows you to turn it out to say if there's free choice mineral or there's a mineral block out in the field or in their stall, that they know exactly how much of that they need to consume. So you can definitely leave it out as an option for your horses, but we want to make sure that what's contained within the diet is actually meeting their requirements per day, and then we'll allow them to look on that as they'd like to. So those are things to just kind of keep in mind. So I'm sorry I went a little bit longer on time, but tried to get through it as quickly as I could. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I put my phone number and my email up there. And then also check out our website, uthorse.com. It's loaded with current information, different resources, and then also activities happening throughout the state. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt and answer any questions if y'all have them.